Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. Fellow Toastmasters, welcome guests, Luna, and whatever other cats are in the room at this moment. We talk a lot about the antagonism between the political parties nowadays, but I'm always reminded of a story, probably occurred last century, between two English politicians, William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli. Gladstone, at one time, when talking about Disraeli, said, "Mr. Disraeli, I predict that you shall die either of the gallows or some venereal disease." Disraeli, upon hearing this, responded, "Well, that depends, Mr. Gladstone. It depends on whether I embrace your principles or your mistress." Fellow Toastmasters and guests, there is a group of stories known as anecdotes. And I really, as a child, did not know what an anecdote was until my father explained it to me. He said, "John, an anecdote is a story that if it isn't true, it really should be. So just keep telling it anyway, because it's fun to tell the story." And so I'm going to share a number of anecdotes that I've picked up over the years. And many of these I have been able to learn from. Well, one of them is also, it goes like this. And I've heard this a couple different ways, but mainly with Winston Churchill. He's at a party and there is a woman there who is arguing with him and disagreeing with him and attacking his politics. And finally, at some point, he turns to the woman and says, "Madam, I have a question for you. Would you sleep with me for £1,000,000? Well, the woman looks taken aback for a moment and says, "Well, I suppose so." Then Churchill looks at her and says, "Madam, would you sleep with me for £10? The woman looks at him and says, "Certainly not. What type of woman do you think I am?" Churchill just looked at her and says, "Madam, we've already determined what type of woman you are. Now we are just haggling about the price." It's a fun story, but it's always taught me something from that one, is that you are always going to be haggling about the price. If you can get a person to say that they would do something if the right circumstances or conditions, then you just have to figure, okay, let's work this out, and you end up haggling. You've determined they will do it. You just have to figure out how much or what needs to be done for you to do it. And I learned so much from that because it's been true my entire life. Another anecdote I have heard also involves Winston Churchill. He's at a party. A woman walks up to him. Apparently she's a teetotaler and disapproves of his smoking, his drinking, his everything. Comes up to Sir Winston and says, "Sir Winston, you are drunk. In fact, you are very, very drunk." Winston Churchill takes another drink, turns to her and says, "Madam, you are ugly. In fact, you are very, very ugly. But in the morning, I shall be sober." This one teaches never really mess with Winston Churchill and try to insult him. You're going to lose. And I've followed that advice my entire life and stay away from Winston Churchill. As growing up, I had heard this story of an interviewer, a reporter, who had gone into the jail to interview a very famous bank robber, Willie Sutton. He'd done a very famous robbery, and the interviewer wanted to talk to him and asked, well, I'm going to say one of the obvious questions, and said to Mr. Sutton, "Sir, I have to ask you, why do you rob banks?" His response, "Because that's where the money is." Sometimes the most obvious response is really the appropriate one, and her question, for the most part, didn't really make sense because, yeah, you rob banks because that's where money is. But the follow-on to that is that when I was researching it one time, I found out, yes, that was printed in a magazine about that's where the money is. But later on, Willie Sutton denied that he ever said it. He said the interviewer just made that up and put it in the magazine because it sounded good. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. But Willie Sutton then found out that it was his most popular phrase. He was known more for that phrase than he was for his bank robberies. And so from then on, he pretended that he did say the phrase and that it really had happened. And as I've gone back through history, I've found so many people and that's one of my goals in life, is to live long enough so that I can say things and nobody can go back and check me about whether I really said it or I really did it. Everyone needs life goals. But there are so many stories, there are so many things that I hear and I just wonder if they're true, but it comes right down, don't let the truth ever get in the way of a good story. Story of a playwright named George Bernard Shaw. Wrote the original play for My Fair Lady, one called Pygmalion. But story of him and his wife, they'd been invited to some very fancy party. They'd gone out to this party and they were talking and it was getting kind of late and his wife decides to sit down. She sees a wicker chair over there. So she goes down and she sits on the wicker chair. Unfortunately, this was not a very sturdy wicker chair. The bottom breaks out. She goes down, her bottom is sticking out the bottom of the chair. Her legs are sort of up. She can't move anywhere at all. George Bernard Shaw sees her do this and just turns to her and says, if I've told you once, I've told you 100 times, that's not funny. And I just enjoy that type of quick wit. Like I say, no idea if these are true, have no idea at all, but just love telling them. But the final one I'm going to leave for you is also from an English playwright, author, generic wit, man named Oscar Wilde. Many stories about him. One story I heard is that before he would go for a weekend or a party, he would write down witty lines and sayings that he could say at the party so that he would not be there unprepared. But one story is, one time he wrote a letter to 10 friends of his, put it in the mail, and all that the note said was, all is discovered, flee. He said within 24 hours, all 10 of them had left the country. So I'm giving you that last word of advice, my fellow Toastmasters. All is discovered, flee. Mr. Toastmaster.